Hi guys, I'm Tony Clark from the Carter Presidential Library. I am really glad to see you. In fact, I owe Paul an apology because the other day I emailed Paul and Frank Reese from Acapella Books and I said, you know, I'm looking at the forecast for Wednesday night, and it's gonna be in the 20s, and by the time we leave, it's gonna be in the teens, and it's gonna be really hard to get an audience here. I just took a picture of you guys and sent it to Frank and said I was so wrong about it. And I even wore my bare socks because I thought it's gonna be awfully cold here tonight. But, you know, I think it's not only a tribute to our speakers tonight, but I think it's an encouraging sign because it shows there are a lot of people who care about preserving the coast and the rivers and things like that, and that's a tribute to all of you. You know, last year, I think this is a great place for Paul's book because I think it was last year we had the book about saving the Chattahoochee River, something that's very close to the heart of President Carter, and before that, Jill Stuckey was here. She gave us a virtual trip of Ossabaw Island and its preservation. In fact, it's interesting. Jill and I were just messaging each other a little bit ago, and today would have been the 111th birthday of Sandy West. And Sandy, as you probably all know, she inherited the island and she worked with President Carter to get that to the state rather than developers so that it could be preserved. And I just think she is an example. And the river keepers are an example that preservation doesn't just happen. It takes people and coalitions, which is one of the things that makes Paul's book so important in looking at the preservation of the coastline. That it takes work, and it took work before, and it continues to take work. Paul Bolster is a former state legislator. He's a historian. And he's somebody who knows about what it takes to forge a coalition to get something done. It's a lot harder to get preservation than it is just clear out something and build something new in its place. In fact, it reminds me of years ago when I was with CNN, we were doing a story on the Dickie Clothing Company, and it's based in Fort Worth, Texas. And the CEO of Dickies had them buy his old elementary school and fix it up so that it could become the company headquarters, which was way more expensive than just tearing it down and building a new structure. But he was interested in preservation. You all are interested in preserving what nature has provided us and to keep it for everybody else. And you know, joining Paul on stage tonight is somebody who shares that interest in preservation. Megan, and I'm gonna mispronounce your last name, DeRosiers. Okay. I'm going to call her Megan.
That's fine.
You know, she is the co-founder and executive director of 100 Miles. That's an organization aimed at preserving and protecting the 100 miles of the coastline. And you know, there's really no better time than right now for us to be talking about that because the legislature is in session. It's time to get them to do something for preservation. So please join me in welcoming Paul and Megan.
Well, thank you for all coming out, and I just want us all to be on the same page about why everybody came out tonight in the cold weather, and it is because you are all dreaming of being on the Georgia coast. I appreciate y'all coming. I especially appreciate Paul inviting me to sit on this stage with him. Thank you for allowing me the privilege of having this conversation with you tonight. So you all know, we're in Atlanta, it's cold, and so I just wanted to kick off the evening by talking a little bit about the Georgia coast so that we can maybe transition our mindset out of shivering and to feeling that warm sun and smelling that salt air and pluff mud. Our coast is a uniquely special place because it doesn't look like the rest of the East Coast. Our coast has 14 barrier islands, only 4 of which are developed, and the other 10 are protected in some form or fashion. We have vast salt marshes that are between 6 and 8 miles wide at any given point, and they are so special that poets have waxed about them for centuries. We are internationally renowned for our shorebird habitat, and we have the oldest volunteer sea turtle program in the world. And as a result of that sea turtle program that started on Little Cumberland Island, the loggerhead and the green and the Ridley sea turtle populations have recovered significantly over the last 50 years, all across the world. In fact, I was just in Costa Rica last week and I watched the hatchlings from a green and a Ridley nest make it to the ocean from a volunteer program that looks a lot like ours here. And we are the location on the East Coast where the North Atlantic right whale comes to calf every year. And you may have seen the news lately that there is an injured calf out there swimming around. He got hit by a boat propeller, and it's on the front page of our newspapers. I know it's been in the Atlanta paper too, across the state. And so our coast, while it may not look like South Carolina or Florida, we here in Georgia take great amounts of pride in what happens on our coast. And our coast is a wonder of the world. But it's a wonder of the world for 2 reasons. 1, because God made it that way. But 2, because, like Tony was saying, people have been working for generations to keep it that way. And this story that Paul has written the book about is about one of those efforts that has been, that has set a precedent for Georgia. Our coast would not look the way it looks today, would not have the lifestyle that it has today without the passage of the Coastal Marshland Protection Act in 1970. And that law would have not passed if it hadn't have been for the effort, the threat, the work, the campaign, the letters written, and Paul will tell you all about that tonight. But what I want you to know that our Salt Marsh Protection Act, while it was passed 50 years ago, it is landmark legislation. It is legislation that no state to the north or to the south has in place today. And as a result, Florida has no marsh. South Carolina has marsh, but it's not as vast as our marsh. And our people are protected, our habitat is special, all because of that salt marsh. And so I know you're not here to listen to me tonight, you're here to listen to Paul. I am so privileged to be able to have this conversation with him. He's a PhD historian. He served in the legislature for 12 years, and today he's here to talk to you about his book.
Well, thank you. You're talking about the marsh. We have marsh. Boston doesn't have any marsh. They built Fenway Park on it. A lot of the northeastern states, before they realized the value of the marsh, they had used it for development for one reason or another. So there's very little marsh up and down the East Coast, maybe even down to New Jersey. I want to start out by doing a short history of this book, or sort of short summary, if you will, the short story of it. But first, there were some other writers that wrote before me, and I ought to call them out. First of all, Charles Seabrook. Is Charles here by any chance? No? Charles Seabrook wrote a wonderful book called The Salt Marsh, and he wrote a chapter on the politics of this. So if you want to read a shorter version of it, you could get his book and look at that. And Chris, and you're going to have to help me with his name. Mangianella wrote a chapter in a book that came out from UGA a couple of years ago called
Southern culture.
Coastal culture, coastal nature, there we go. So there are people that have written before me, and even Reed Harris wrote a wonderful book, which UGA has republished, and it's a very unique thing that I think attracted me and made it possible to write my book, was here's a legislator talking about what they went through. How many times do you ever hear a legislator talk about what they went through to try to get their bill passed? And so that's a wonderful book too, because it has that insight of an individual that worked on the legislation. So here's the short story. May the 24th, 1968, Kerr McGee, along with Charles, I was gonna get that right.
No.
Oh, I don't have it. He was a former candidate for governor, and he was a full partner in King and Spalding. They walked into Lester Maddox's office for a meeting of the Mineral Releasing Commission. And Maddox, of course, was all excited. Here's jobs on the coast. We're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. They wanted to lease 72,000 acres of the coast, including Little Tybee Island, all the Warsaw Sound, and 2 miles out to sea. 72,000 acres was what they wanted the state to lease them.
Hey, wait, let me interrupt you. The salt marsh is less than 400,000 acres, so almost a quarter of the salt marsh.
A huge chunk. And what they were gonna do for it, they had discovered phosphate underneath it, in some cases 100 feet down. They were gonna dig off the surface, pile it up and create real estate, and then dig out the phosphate underneath it, process it, and dump the waste into the Atlantic with a big pipeline out to sea. So that was the start of this. So Maddox was in this meeting, and he made two very critical decisions. And you have to appreciate these coming from Lester, who he only graduated from the 11th. He didn't graduate, he quit school in the 11th grade. He said, we want an environmental impact study. There's no EPA at the time, and he wanted the university system to study this issue, and they did. The second thing he decided there needed to be public hearings. So he appointed Attorney General Arthur Bolton to do public hearings in Atlanta and Savannah. And the public hearings were unique because everybody that came got a chance to talk. They had to postpone the end of the hearing in Savannah, so it lasted 2 days. 100 people spoke. They virtually sold out the DeSoto Hilton ballroom for people who wanted to come and hear about the issue. So the public hearings were a way that scientists and advocacy groups, individual citizens could come and speak their piece so that legislators and the officials would know what the public had to say. So remember those public hearings, and that's an important part of what happened. So after a while, Maddox decided this was a bad idea, and he sort of let the contract run out. So that was the end of the mining thing. The mining thing sort of ends with a little bit of a whimper. He just ignores the contract and it goes away. But the problem was there was no legislation on the books of Georgia, no laws, no EPA. None of that existed at the time to regulate how the coast was going to be used. So Reed Harris, who had gotten involved in the mining debate, he decided there needed to be legislation. He's a legislator, a lawyer, a property lawyer, a real estate lawyer from Brunswick, who is part of the elite business community in Brunswick. And he decided he's going to have to protect the marsh with legislation. So 69, he introduced a bill. It was very controversial. It had public hearings, but it also came to the floor one time and got beat. He sent it back under reconsideration to committee. It went to subcommittee, it went to committee again, it went to the rules committee, it went to the floor again, and it passed by one vote, and that was the vote of the Speaker of the House. He only votes if he needs one extra vote for a bill to pass. So to get the final vote, it came from the Speaker. It was late in the session, and went over to the Senate, and in the Senate, Al Holloway was the head of the industry committee, and Reed said to himself, this bill's dead. It went to the committee in charge of industry and development in the state. But they didn't know about Al Holloway. He said he'd hold it for a while, but he then did hearings, he investigated it, he became majority leader as well, and in the Senate, that bill passed with no opposing votes. It's a little bit of a commentary on how the Senate may operate differently than the House. It came back to the House and it squeaked out of the House by, I think it's 5 votes to final the passage. Then the big scene is that the Maddox waits and waits and waits, and whether he's going to sign it or not, or whether he's going to veto it. And he finally comes in and they have a session and he signs the bill and he says to Reed, you know, I got barrels of letters back there in favor of this bill. Those barrels of letters came from the garden clubs. So that's kind of a short history. That's kind of a short history of what happened. And so let's go on and we'll talk about a few more things.
Yeah, I want to use this time that we have to dive into that summary a little bit more in detail. And we all know that the 1960s was a tumultuous time in the country and in the state of Georgia. And so given the political situation and context of the time, what kind of led to the coastal marshlands protection?
Well, the political environment of the state was such that, this is my conclusion after reading all this stuff, is that we were sort of getting out of massive resistance. So probably Governor Sanders was responsible for kind of twisting the trajectory of Georgia politics away from the resistance of the Civil Rights Acts and the Supreme Court decisions. It's really ironic that the poster child for massive resistance is the governor. That's Lester Maddox. But even in his administration, the state continues to turn away from the issues of massive resistance to civil rights. The other most important thing that happened in the election when Maddox is elected in 1966 is a movement to make the legislature independent of the governor. Yeah, that's an interesting, and it's a fascinating story. Reed Harris wrote a little memo that outlines what all happened and all the details and all the letters that went back and forth. But what happened was that he and 4 other members of the Judiciary Committee got together and said, well, let's invite the Democrats to have a caucus right after the election is over, and we'll decide who our own speaker is. We won't wait around to see what the governor wants as a speaker, because then that speaker will select all the committee chairs, things like that. So they did that, and so the irony of it was that they ended up being in office, and George L. Smith is elected, but he's elected and Maddox isn't. So Maddox didn't have, neither of the candidates for president in 1966 had a clear majority, and so the legislature had to come together and choose them. So the legislature chose Maddox before, but they had declared their independence. Now that's an important part of Georgia's political history that oftentimes is not talked about. So the reality is the legislature is running itself at that point. The governor's not running them. They're running their own business and setting the policy of the state. So that's an important change. Okay. Also remember that 1968 is a traumatic year in American politics. It's the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and massive protest movements in Chicago at the convention, and massive riots around the country. And it's a protest against the Vietnam War. In many cases, legislators are looking out the window when the bill's being debated at the protest that's going on around the Capitol over Vietnam. So that's the kind of the context in which the legislature put its attention and put its efforts into a conservation bill. Now you can make of that whatever you choose, but that's the context I think here is important about what's happening in the General Assembly. So, let's see. And the other thing though is that what I came to the conclusion that the traditional center of Georgia politics is development. Maddox was for that, Sanders was for that, all the governors after that were for that, and the current administration is certainly for that. So if there's any central theme of Georgia politics is how do we develop wealth in the state? We have disagreements over things, but there's not really any disagreement, either partisan or in individual campaigns, about that issue, that we want to develop wealth in the state. I think it comes from our Reconstruction period, our period when there was very little wealth in the state, but that's a difference about how Georgia politics works. My opinion again.
I think what you're describing sounds like chaos. So how did we get the Coastal Marshland Protection Act out of all of that?
Well, the important thing is it's an open process, and we get it because we have Reed Harris deciding there's gonna be a bill. So there's no bill like this anywhere in the country. He actually writes the bill himself from little pieces of things he's gotten from other states. And he's willing as a leader to revise it. So it actually goes through 19 different revisions. Some of them are small, some are kind of amendments, but there's 19 different versions of this bill. So that's a part of the process, the political process, legislative process. It's important for all of us to remember. You gotta keep revising it. You gotta keep changing it. Now, the opposition to this was largely from people that wanted to develop the coast with industry and with real estate. That was they thought the purpose of the coast was. We could have been like Houston, I think. I think Brunswick could have been like Houston. Heavy industry being developed on our coast. So Georgia had a decision to make about whether or not that was gonna be the case. So the bill ends up being the catalyst in which all of these people managed to coordinate their efforts in order to try to do something different than had been done in other states.
So let's go back to, well, I think y'all know that I'm, as you heard from Tony, the CEO of the Coastal Conservation Organization. We're called 100 Miles. And one of the things that we are constantly struggling with is fighting bad ideas versus getting good ideas passed or adopted or putting them forth. And so let's go back to the threat of the mining situation and talk to us about who responded to that threat and what that opposition looked like. Because a minute ago you said it kind of just fell away, but I want to know why it fell away.
Well, there were the scientists that were involved in this. So at the time, the public didn't think the marsh was worth anything. But there had been 15 years of scientific investigations out of the UGA Marine Science Institute on Sapelo Island. They produced 2,000 scientific papers. They had 2 international conferences there that dealt with the issue of what was the value of the marsh. So these scientists had proven the value of the marsh, that it provided the nutrients that kept the ocean alive, kept the shrimp alive, kept the right whale alive. Without all of the hierarchy of larger and smaller animals were kept alive by the marsh. So that was an extremely important part of the data, the scientific information behind the legislation. And the scientists all came. They came to all the hearings. The other thing is the state kind of organized. There was a group of students at the zoology department at UGA. One of them had been a member of the Sierra Club. So he decided maybe we should have a Sierra Club group. And so he sent out a notice to the 10 members of the Sierra Club to come to Atlanta and see if they wanted to create a group. And 10 people showed up. He became the secretary. The other guy that wrote the letter became the president. So at the hearings, there was the Sierra Club. They could show up and give their testimony and tell what they wanted. There was also the creation of the Georgia Conservancy at the time. So somewhat more business oriented, but people out of DeKalb County that helped to create the Conservancy. A guy that was active in that became the head of the Georgia Natural Resources Organization, which Sanders created. They had studied the state to see where these natural areas were that should be preserved. So there was that basis that was there as well. Let's see, I had any notes here. Let me look at my notes.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
Jane.
Yeah.
So the opposition, to great extent, was based on private property. William Harrison was a legislator from St. Mary's, and he made the strongest argument because he wanted the opportunity to develop the coast. Charles Frazier was the developer of Hilton Head. He wanted to develop different sections of the islands. He actually owned 3,000 acres of Cumberland at the time, so he wanted that to develop. Well, Harrison was an attorney for Frazier. That was disclosed at a certain key point that he was actually getting paid as an attorney by the guy. So they had hearings. President Carter showed up at one of the hearings about Cumberland. So Cumberland is involved in this issue too. It's exactly the same time. that all these hearings are taking place. The other people were wealthy land owners of the islands. Sam Candler virtually grew up as a teenager on northern Cumberland Island, and he created the Island Owners Association. So that group was under the table a little bit, supporting the legislation. They sort of disappear from the records because the Marshland Protection Act actually protects them. You protect the islands by not letting causeways to get over to them so that you can develop them like Hilton Head. So the island owners were also a big part of that process. And there were other key leaders. That was Rock Howard. I wish you'd read the book and the stories in there about Rock Howard. He was the head of the Water Quality Control Commission, and there's a wonderful story about him in there. And George Bagby. George Bagby was the head of the
Fish head.
Fish and Game. There you go, Fish and Game. His legislative friends called him Fish Head. And so he was a guy that led the sportsmen to the table to get things done. So you had this coalition of students. The students were sending out curriculum for middle school teachers to be able to teach about the coast. You had the garden clubs. I didn't talk about Jane Yarn. So Jane Yarn was a wonderful North Side elite leader, part of the Piedmont Driving Club and United Way Drive. She headed one of those, and her husband was the chief plastic surgeon at Piedmont. So she had resources, and Jane Yarn shows up everywhere. She shows up speaking to the Sierra Club. She's the secretary for the Island Owners Association. She's in creating a conference. She's listing all the people going to testify at the hearing. And she's the head of environmental conservation for the garden clubs. So not only is she active in all these, but she has this army behind her of all the garden club ladies who wanted to maybe do something different than the flower arranging and gardening and that kind of thing. They were very much engaged in the conservation movement. So the garden clubs were kind of the engines behind the movement.
So, well, before we ask you the next question, here is a vintage bumper sticker from the time of the campaign that somebody gave me as a gift last year. I thought I'd bring it. So, you talked about the opposition to the mine, and so did that opposition transition into support for the bill?
Right.
Okay.
The point was that there was no law. There was no law in the books regulating the coast. There was no EPA. That's hard to imagine. There were no environmental impact studies. So when the legislation is put in, the group that got together under the crisis that happened with the mining proposal, they were all in connection with each other, all coordinated, and they were ready to go in support of the legislation. So also they were used to going to public hearings. So there were 7 public hearings that took place on the legislation, both in the House and in the Senate. Very unusual amount of public access. I guess the other element was the press. The newspapers covered all these activities almost on a daily basis. You read the AJC, read the Constitution back then, even the Savannah Morning News, every other issue is what's happening to the legislation. What did the subcommittee do? What did the committee do? What are these people saying? It's amazing the amount of press coverage that there was for it. So it's the organization, it's the people that helped to create this coalition moving in the direction of the legislation.
So talk to us about some lessons learned that maybe can be used today.
So this is something that you ought to read the book and get your own answer to. And I'm sort of serious about this. I'm a narrative historian, I think. I like telling the stories, and there's just wonderful stories in this book, and the whole book is a story about the bill. But I did, at the end, I drew some conclusions about the political process, but you shouldn't just take mine. You gotta see what this means in terms of Georgia's political history, what it means to you today, or what it meant back then. The first point is there's a crisis. So the mining, there has to be a crisis to get the political process going. It's kind of the gist, and then you gotta be ready to take advantage of the crisis and move on it. But there obviously has to be some kind of a crisis. You had to have courageous leadership, and Reed Harris ran for office. He never ran again. His life got changed as a result of this legislation. Part of it, he never really told why that was. I never could find a definitive example of that, but he was certainly dedicated to this, and maybe it was the 8.5-hour drive from Brunswick to get to the Capitol, or maybe it was his kids, or maybe he wanted to go back to his real estate practice. But the other thing, Jane Yarn is a key issue. So these leaders that were there that articulated the issues and provided the coordination with people. The good data is another issue. That made a way to say it today. The scientists provided the data. An open legislative process, the public hearings, and the study committees. So I think legislators ought to have more study committees, and they ought to be very open, and the hearings ought to be very open for everybody to come and speak their piece. That's how we find out what the public wants to do, if they want to find that out. You also have to get across the political divide. It was easier back then. As a percentage, more legislators actually voted for the bill that were Republican than were Democrats. So there was no divide between the parties over environmental issues. One of the biggest environmentalists at the time was Barry Goldwater. People don't think of that, the conservative side. He wrote a whole chapter in his book, Conscience of Conservatives, on the environmental movement. He voted for every wilderness bill. He supported Nixon in his effort to create EPA. So there was not that huge political divide. So that makes things different today, because it does seem to be, with the politics being closely aligned, close competition, that both sides tend to maybe get the gap between them gets bigger as a result of that. But clearly back then it had to be bipartisan, and as I said, detailed press coverage and effective organizations connecting the grassroots. In the back of the book, there's 25 environmental organizations now that are working on preserving these. There's Megan's organization. There's a whole host of organizations that you can get engaged in. And maybe they're having to sort of replace the press coverage that used to happen, because I don't think the press coverage is happening today as it used to. But those are, I think, the key takeaways for me.
In your book, you have a really awesome map.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Here he goes.
There it is.
Good. I wondered if you could talk through those.
Well, the map is important because for me, I was studying the period 68 to 70. If you look closely on it, down near Brunswick, there's a little Egg Island and Wolf Island,
I'm gonna
and
point
it
it out.
says 1969.
Here.
So Jane Yarn heard they were for sale. She went and got the conservation, nature, conservancy to get interested in it. She raised the money, and they bought those two little islands. Those two little islands now are part of the flyway, which they're important, and they're regulated by the state. If you look further north at Warsaw Island, the family that owned that was concerned about this, and they did the same process by which they put their island under a conservation easement. And then all of these islands along the coast are now all controlled by the state through environmental easements and through ownership. So Georgia, all of the ocean-facing islands, except there's two or three exceptions to that, and that's St. Simon and Sea Island. Little Sea Island is now a conservation area.
Little St. Simon.
Saint John.
Little St. Simons is now a conservation area. The whole estuary up and down the Altamaha River, if you see all those cross marks there,
Let me point
on
this out.
40 miles,
So this is the Altamaha River Conservation Corridor, and it's actually 60 miles.
60 miles.
Of no riverfront opportunities for development or industry. If you look at all of these crosshatched, these are all protected in some way or another. And then when you think about the salt marsh, sorry, I'm jumping in, is that okay? It's okay, no worries.
You know more about this than I do.
And then if you look at this area of the salt marsh that is protected by the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act, you see this contiguous landscape of conservation that is both from land conservation, from landowners and state and federal acquisitions, also through political action like the passage of the Coastal Marshland Protection Act. And this land conservation and policy protection with the Coastal Marshlands Protection Act is why our coast is so unique today. The 4 islands I mentioned at the beginning that are bridged, we have bridges to 4 of our islands, and therefore they're developed, are Jekyll, St. Simons, Sea Island, and Tybee. So that's
One of the things that excited me was a chance to talk to the people in charge of the acquisition of property. Across from Cumberland is, what's the name of the?
Ceylon or
Ceylon.
Cabin Bluff.
Cabin Bluff.
Cabin Bluff.
So early on, they managed to buy Cabin Bluff because the Sea Island company went into bankruptcy. The corporation that owned it, the state bought it from them. That's about 10,000 acres. And recently, in the last 2 years, they bought the next big piece of land of 17,000 acres. So across from Cumberland now, there's 28,000 acres of preserved
So
environmentally sensitive land. It's the largest tract of sensitive environmental land on the East Coast.
So this is Cumberland right here. This is Cabin Bluff.
And then see,
And then inland a little bit is,
Yeah.
I don't think that's on this map because
Right.
it's more recent than the map, the
Right.
acquisition, but it's like right around here is where Ceylon
it's the
is.
last exit on 95, and you go in and then there's a little gate, you go in that and there's 28,000 acres there to explore. Where the longleaf pine is being replanted, the gopher turtle, the various kind of elements of the environment that requires that. So Georgia gets this A+ in terms of acquiring a sensitive land, an
Yeah.
A+.
Actually, go back one slide, or
Sorry.
did you switch that?
I did.
Oh, good, can you go back? So, sorry, this is Cabin Bluff right here. This is, right around here is where Ceylon was. For those of you familiar with the Spaceport Camden project, it was gonna go right here. So if you think about all of that protected land and marsh and Cumberland Island, and then a project that could have really threatened all of that.
So at the end of my book, I talked a lot about the current kind of threats. I did several months worth of research on what was going on now, and that was the spaceport in Camden County. That was sea rise, and sea rise is the ultimate issue that Georgia ought to face. It ought to listen to its scientists and try to figure out how it responds, either to adapt or to do things that don't stop development where that sea rise is going to affect. Let's see, was the third one?
Development.
The general development on the coast. Everybody's going to try to get as close to the sea as they possibly can. So those are going to be ongoing issues that the environmental movement has got to deal with, and I guess the main point here is, if you want to get to a conclusion, and then we can get to some questions, is that there's no end to an environmental movement. It doesn't come to an end and it's over, you've won the battle. It's just one battle, one small skirmish after another, and it has to be continued. I was reading today, there's a wonderful periodical that keeps up with this called The Current. It's online, it's one of those online newspapers. And they had an article on the fact that last year, energy sources, other than fuel and petroleum, were the cheapest, were the largest development of those energy resources in the last 3 decades. That they think that it's an opportunity by 1930 to reach the goal of tripling the resources, the energy that comes from the photovoltaics and from from the wind and other kind of things. So there's a huge opportunity here for us. That society seems to be moving really in that direction, but still, it's never kind of over.
Well, on that note, I do wanna get to questions, but I spent the day at the Capitol today. And, I know lots of people in this room also spend their days at the Capitol, but, I wanna get your perspective on maybe some bills. I have my perspective, but I'd like to hear your perspective on some bills that are,
Sure.
under consideration right now.
Sure. The one that bothers me, I guess, the most is the regulation that's in front of the, is it in front of DNR? I guess it's in front of DNR, or is it in front of the?
It's in front of the DNR board.
For the DNR board. They're gonna have a hearing on the 19th. They're putting the control of the buffer, the marsh buffer, into the hands of the soil and sedimentation people, rather than in the coastal resources division. It's always been a difficult thing, because the Coastal Marshland Protection Act, even Reed Harris said it protects the marsh, it doesn't protect the upland. So how do you go about protecting the upland? And some of that has been through the soil and sedimentation buffers. But what they want to do is exempt individual owners from the requirements of not building in the buffer. And the biggest part of that is building the hard coast, so that you're building those things that going to protect somebody's property, but then the water's going to go around and not protect the next person's property, and so you're going to have to keep stringing out. And if you want to get an understanding of what those structures do, you just go down to St. Simon and look off the Johnson Rocks there in the village,
Yeah.
and there's no marsh there, and there's certainly no sand there. So what happens when you put those hard coastal structures in place is the water comes in and it goes down, the force goes down, and it digs out any possibility of a marsh. So that's really a bad thing, that individual owners would be able to build without any permit by the coastal division. So that one bothers me the most. There is a strange bill about the King's Grant. Nobody can figure out why it benefits anybody, but somebody wants to be able to sell their King's Grant marsh, which is probably underwater anyway by now, and then be able to transfer that to some other project that is going to do conservation kind of work, or?
Well, it's like I don't know if y'all are familiar with mitigation, but so right now, the state of Georgia holds the marsh in a public trust for the people of Georgia. And there are a few people who have evidence of a King's Grant that was granted by the King of England 250 years ago, more than that. And those King's Grants often say things like, you can have ownership of this land or salt marsh, whatever it is, salt marsh let's talk about, if you have every generation of sons from here on out serve in the military. Or, weird things that are things that nobody has complied with. And if they have, then it's a miracle, and God bless them, they can have their salt marsh, right? But this bill, and so anyway, when you want to prove that you had King's Grant, you have to submit all this paperwork to the Attorney General's office, and then they kind of take years to verify it, and then you can own your salt marsh. But you still really can't build a bridge over it. You still really can't do anything with it, except if you want to potentially take credit for restoring that salt marsh, then you can monetize that restoration by working with somebody who's destroying salt marsh in another place and taking money from them to restore. Well, in this case, the state of Georgia is holding all of this salt marsh, and it's really not in bad shape. So the idea is that somebody with a piece of paper can now go, under this bill, can now go through an expedited process through a judge, and in 60 days they can have proof of title to their salt marsh. So, I mean, you could do it, I could do it, anybody who has a piece of paper, it doesn't have to be authentic, it could be fraudulent, it could be any kind of piece of paper that says you have access to salt marsh. And then the salt marsh gets privatized, and then they can monetize it, which, you can probably tell I'm highly opinionated about this, but, it's fraud, right? You take salt marsh that's already protected, you turn it over to a private citizen, and that's the threat, right? And then the private citizen gets paid not to execute the threat of whatever it is that they could possibly do. It's just crap. And so the bill is in front of the Judiciary Committee right now in the House, and it had a hearing last week, but it did not move forward, and we're still working on it. So you kind of went on your tirade about the DNR thing, and I went on my tirade. So
Part of the, one of the things I haven't explained very well is that the ownership of the marsh was a critical issue in the history. So Reed Harris knew how to go and research titles through the Glenn County Courthouse. When he was a first year kind of lawyer, he had to go and research that title, and he had to try to trace it back to a King's Grant. And the King's Grant was the original. So if you didn't have a King's Grant, then the argument was that the rest of it was owned by the king. So if the water came over your land and the king gave you a grant, you had the upland grant, but the king retained ownership over the marsh, over all the water going up the Thames or wherever up the little streams where the water went. The king retained ownership of that, even though he was giving the grant away to his friends of the upland. So the point in the legislation is the state owned the marsh. And that finally got confirmed by the Georgia Supreme Court, that in fact the state owns all the marshland based on that historical acquisition of rights that actually come from the King of England. So that's the fundamental issue, that the state owns the marsh. And this is, a critical part of this particular debate.
yeah, one more bill, just for the sake of talking about it, is because of the similarities, is the Okefenokee bill.
So I did mean to talk about that one. One of the concerns that I have is that, as I've tried to explain in this talk about how the legislature was an open process, you got a chance to put your bill in, it went through committee, came out of committee, the speaker called your bill. My concern is that a lot of bills now don't get a chance to be voted on. And the Okefenokee Swamp Bill is one of the major ones like that. It had 94 signatures last year.
It has more than that now.
And more of that now, and has never been voted on by a committee or by the General Assembly.
Well,
So-
and tell the significance of 94.
Oh, well, 94 means that you have to have 91 votes in order to pass. So that it has a majority of the legislators actually as authors of the bill, and it's not being allowed to be voted on. So there's lots of other bills that are like that. So it's a general change in the legislative process from where I was when I was there, and also from where Reed was in terms of the openness of the process he had. Had 17 gun safety bills last year, and none of them got voted on. You have consistently there's another one that I'm interested in, the payday lending bill, that never gets voted on. Of course, you never vote on Medicaid, you never vote on a huge number of issues. That's minority government, and it bothers me a lot that this process has gone so far away from some of the original ideas of legislative independence. I see Tony standing up
This
over
might be a
there.
good time to take questions.
I
from
think
you.
so, maybe.
You all have questions. This is kind of a call to action. So I'm sure you have questions about what you can do.
And while you're thinking of your questions, I want to recognize, Tony, you mentioned Sally Bethay's book. Sally is in the audience, founder of the Chattahoochee River Keeper. We've got partners from the Sierra Club here as well, Sam Collier, Neil Herring, and Mark Woodall. And I'm sorry if I don't notice who else is here, but I just wanted to give a shout out to them. That is the dream team of advocates here, so I'm impressed and thankful. Yes, ma'am. Oh, Nancy Claire, hi.
So the legislative process, we're
She said, the legislative process where things don't get voted on now, why did that change and how can we change it back?
I think it's probably because of the partisan divide. That people are more vigorous in their position, that they want to create the agenda that's going to help them get elected in the next election. So it's more focused on that rather than necessarily on the public policy. I was a somewhat liberal legislator, urban. My district was 62% African American. I was not kind of in the mainstream of what the legislature was, but I had lots of bills that I put in. I thought they were wonderful. They got to the floor and they got killed. But that's okay. That's what the public process should be. Also, back then, you didn't, if you were in a hurry and you got your bill introduced early, it went to committee, you got it out of committee, and then you begged the speaker and he called it, you didn't have to go to the rules committee. Now you go to the rules committee, and on every bill has to go to the rules committee. They sort of operate more like the Congress does, with control in the hands of a few people at the top of the process. I wasn't supposed to say all that, but
Well,
I don't know how you get it back. I think you should take a careful look at when the next election happens, a careful look at the rules, somebody looking at the rules and making arguments about the rules. That's the time when that change has to happen, is when they adopt the first section of the rules.
Neil.
In your book, which I read,
Neil Herring, lobbyist.
Hey, Neil.
you point out repeatedly that all of the public officials involved in the marshlands issue were on the same side, and it was the right side, the agency people. And that was before they created DNR and all that stuff. But Bagby, all of those guys, they were all lined up for the bill, all the way through. That's no longer the case.
Right.
The agencies are against us. The agencies are pushing that bill to let them drive pilings in front of the aisle. That's the Coastal Resources Division. EPD is famously resistant to any kind of positive change. That makes a huge difference. And the governor could make them do the right thing. He's not interested in doing that, because this governor particularly, I mean, is it not true? This governor is the most brilliant, calculated politician we've ever had. Never makes any enemy he doesn't have to make. And all of this stuff makes enemies, well-heeled enemies, and he won't do it.
I think it was amazing to me when I started reading about George Bagby. George Bagby loved the legislature. The story in there,